Metro 2033 is the 2010 video game adaptation of the 2002 novel by the same name. It's a first-person shooter with survival horror elements, a lot of charm, and a lot of problems. The game was published by THQ and it was Ukraine-based 4A Studios' first game. And while Dmitry Glukovsky, who wrote the novel, got a writing credit on the game, it's clear that most of the writing was done in-house by 4A. The game was directed by Andrew Prokhorov, who would go on to direct its two sequels, Metro Last Light and Metro Exodus. Let's start with some stats. Metro 2033 has a Metacritic score of 81 and a user score of 8.1, and is 9.5 hours long according to How Long to Beat. I first played Metro 2033 back in 2013, and I have a distinct memory of having the game pitched to me from someone at my school as Russian Fallout. And while I think that comparison is shallow, it certainly sold me on the game. I remember liking Metro and generally finding the story interesting when I first played it, but upon returning to it for this discussion, the rose-tinted glasses shattered. That's not to say the game is bad, or that I didn't enjoy my time with it, or at least the majority of my time with it. I like to play games on their hardest difficulty setting when I review them. I find that forces me to engage more deeply with them, and that it often exposes flaws in the combat, which you wouldn't notice on normal difficulty. For Metro 2033 though, I had to lower the difficulty a lot to get through the game. Partly because I got stuck at least 5 separate spots where I was genuinely not able to progress, but also because it gave me time to look at the game's UI, which is turned off on the highest difficulty, called Ranger Hardcore. I must say that while Metro 2033 certainly was a tough play, and it showed its age, there's a lot to love here. One of the things which set Metro 2033 apart from both many of its contemporaries and most current FPS games is that it's heavily inspired by survival horror games. The player has genuinely limited ammunition. Levels are often dark, and the player has to manage their gas mask filters and charge up their flashlights manually. The design does get a bit confused sometimes though, when the game wants to have classic action beats coupled with its survival horror influences. The best example of this is that the player heals over time when out of combat, like in most FPS single player campaigns, but there is also a limited amount of healing items like in a survival horror game. While there are missteps, I like the overall design of the game because of how it always tries to make the player feel close to the player character Artyom. Metro 2033 always tries to find diegetic ways to communicate to the player. Need to know what your next objective is? Check your clipboard. Need to know how much air you have left in your gas mask filter? Check your watch. The term immersive gets thrown around a lot in the gaming space, with publishers often using it as a buzzword which roughly translates to fun, but Metro is immersed in the original sense of the word. By locking the player in a first-person perspective during gameplay and relying on diegetic sources of information as much as possible, the game immerses the player in the game world, and it's this immersion which weighs up most of the game's flaws, at least in my eyes. As mentioned, Metro is primarily a shooter, so let's start by discussing the shooting. The guns are pretty standard hit scan with random spread, and as far as I could tell, there are no consistent spray patterns. The arsenal Artyom has access to is mainly automatics and semi-autos. The guns are alright, if a little weak sounding. One of the main gimmicks Metro has is its ammo system, where some guns can switch between homemade and military-grade ammunition. Mil-spec rounds are rarer, but do more damage, so you might see them as straight upgrades, but Metro manages to be more complex than that by using mil-spec ammo as the game's currency as well as an ammo type. Realistically though, military ammo isn't enough of an upgrade to be worth bothering with for the most part, and after you've passed the game's final shop, you almost completely transition to using military ammo as the game starts handing it out like it's flyers for a Bible study group. I don't think Metro's shooting is anything to write home about, but it's certainly passable, and never got in the way of enjoying the game for me. That can unfortunately not be said for the level design and enemy placement. I said in the Dark Messiah video that what sets different encounters apart in first-person shooters is level design more than the enemies you fight, and Metro is a prime example. On some levels I had no issue fighting groups of enemies, and on some levels just 3 enemies were so overwhelmingly difficult that I had to lower the difficulty setting to be able to progress. You can make the case that it's a skill issue and I just suck at shooters for not being able to clear this level on Ranger Hardcore, but you can't make a serious case that this encounter isn't substantially harder than many later fights in the game due to a frustrating level design which has almost no cover while also forcing you to attack through a narrow path. In a way, the game's setting creates some real constraints for the level designers. I would certainly not like to have to make series of underground concrete tunnels become varied and interesting gameplay locations, but in another sense a lot of the issues were self-imposed. As we'll see later, the game takes some liberties with regards to its source material, and there is no reason that the level designers couldn't have had Artyom travel to more maintenance tunnels or feature the surface more frequently in order to make the levels better. The problems with level design go beyond insane difficulty spikes from encounter to encounter though. At one point I managed to get myself soft locked in a section where I didn't have enough gas mask filters to proceed. Every time I died I would go back to my last autosave, which was at a point where there were no more filters to be found. The solution was to quit the game and start from the beginning of the chapter, and while it's great that there was a solution to this problem, it sucks that it happened in the first place. This might seem like a weird and oddly specific issue to spend so much time on, but I think it's an instructive case which shows how Metro's mechanics conspire to create problems. On one hand, this is a level design issue, as the player is locked into being on the surface where Artyom will die without gas mask filters, which becomes a problem when a set piece action scene blocks off the path you came from. On the other hand, it would also be a problem if there were filters everywhere. The filters really felt important for the rest of my playthrough, as the game had clearly shown that it wasn't bluffing when it came to enforcing the gas mask mechanic. It's also a problem with the save system, which doesn't let the player have enough freedom to go back to a save before the set piece autosave without doing the chapter all over again. This sort of soft lock only happened once in my time with the game, but it shows how Metro's rough edges make the game difficult to work with. And while the gameplay has some rough edges, those edges are far rougher in the story. As mentioned, Metro 2033 the game is an adaptation of Metro 2033 the novel. The main plot is generally the same, and while the world is beautifully realized in the game, I think Metro 2033 categorically fails as an adaptation. Every message the novel tries to impart is missing in the game, and the main story is made worse by making a small but very important omission in the game's introduction. If you want the spoiler-free review of the story, it would be this. Pretty good book, the game made a mess of it. From here on, there will be spoilers, though, to be honest, I wouldn't worry about it too much unless you think you might read the book someday. The game starts with its protagonist Artyom living in the Moscow metro 20 years after a global nuclear war made the surface an everlasting nuclear winter wonderland. Artyom lives at the exhibition station and has lived there since the bombs fell, but the station is under attack from mysterious mutants known as the Dark Ones. The station keeps mowing them down with machine gun fire, but the Dark Ones are unrelenting, and it's not clear where they are coming from. Just being near the Dark Ones put people in the hospital, so it's vital for Exhibition to stop the flow of mutants into the metro. If they overrun Exhibition, they could wipe out all of humanity. One day a man called Hunter arrives at Exhibition to discuss the Dark One situation and goes to personally investigate where the mutants are entering the metro. He gives Artyom his dog tags and tells him to bring him to the center of the metro, Polis, if he doesn't return. Predictably, Hunter doesn't return, so Artyom heeds the call of adventure and sets out for the capital of the metro. Artyom travels through the metro with a couple of different companions, and we're introduced to the major factions, dangers, and quirks of post-nuclear Moscow. Artyom travels with a man called Bourbon until he's killed by bandits, after which he meets a mystic known as Khan who explains the supernatural aspects of the setting. Khan speculates that nuclear fire destroyed heaven and caused the hell that is living in the metro. After Khan's section, Artyom gets trapped in a war between the Reds and the Reich, two competing factions in the metro who act out wars of the past and new in the tunnels. While Artyom is trudging through the tunnels, he gets periodic nightmares involving the Dark Ones. Finally, after many trials and tribulations, Artyom makes it to Polis, the legendary capital of the metro. And here we get to see the splendor of the Soviet-built Moscow metro in all its glory. We get to see the height of post-apocalyptic civilization. Imagine the immense disappointment 4A set me up for with its ruthless focus on immersion and the lively stations we saw in the early game. The game skips straight past Polis onto the next big set piece, the library. In the novel, Artyom went to the library to find a book one faction of Polis considers holy, but in the game we go there to find a map of a secret government facility known as D6. In the novel, the idea of a secret metro tunnel built for use by Soviet leadership has been mentioned at several points, and different characters have different views regarding whether it's real or not. In the game, D6 comes out of nowhere. Incidentally, according to a quick Wikipedia search, it looks like Metro 2, i.e. a secret Soviet metro line under Moscow for use by Soviet leadership, does, or at least did, exist. But I digress. D6 is an impressive underground facility where Artyom and his allies stumble across the worst escort quest known to man. And one of the most disappointing boss fights in novel adaptation history. The gang leaves with a device which is used to send cruise missiles, and they go to a tower near Exhibition where they can get a view of the Dark One's hive. The game ends with Artyom either destroying the Dark Ones or, if you've managed to accrue enough karma points, sparing them. To me, what made the novel's plot interesting was partly the unique setting, partly its themes of humanity's warlike nature, and its political commentary. The game completely fails to include the themes and commentary. I think it's fair to say that the game's story is primarily an adventure story with horror elements. It's about a young man who goes on an adventure and saves his hometown. What genre would you guess the book is? I'll give you a hint. It's not an adventure story. It's, in fact, a tragedy. What makes the original a tragedy is that the reason why the Dark Ones were entering the metro was that Artyom and his friends went to explore the surface at a neighboring station when he was young, and they forgot to close the door. The visions about the Dark Ones Artyom has been receiving in the novel could be interpreted as his guilt about causing the Dark Ones' assault, but at the very end of the novel, it dawns on Artyom that the Dark Ones have been trying to communicate with him. The reason why they keep coming and never physically attack is because they're trying to communicate psychically. For some reason, Artyom is the only one they can get in touch with, and they interpreted him leaving the door open as a kind gesture. But by the time Artyom realizes this, the missiles are already in the air. He has unwittingly brought destruction on a peaceful race, and one which could have thrived in the post-apocalypse. The game bafflingly decided not to include the fact that the Dark One's invasion was Artyom's fault, which really undermines the tragedy. Tragedy is so often built on understanding. It's not tragic that Artyom destroys mutants, it's tragic that he realizes the nobility of the Dark Ones when he has already doomed them. I read the novel's point to be that violent humans can't coexist peacefully, not with each other, and certainly not with other intelligent life, and it's this fatal flaw which destroyed humanity in the first place. Given that it was written by a Russian author and first published about 2 years after the Second Chechen War and the Siege of Grozny, it's not hard to see why Glukhovsky had such a dim view of humanity in Metro 2033. For me, the novel's most memorable sequence involves the biomass monster which we fight in D6 in the game, located under the Kremlin in the book. In the book, the Kremlin was hit by an experimental bioweapon which turned people into a homogeneous biomass, and anyone who looked at the star atop the Kremlin was entranced, doomed to be absorbed into the monstrosity. In American foreign policy before the Trump years, the foreign policy established was sometimes nicknamed the Blob. The reason was that, no matter party affiliation and background, most foreign policy experts agreed on how America should conduct its foreign policy. To me, Glukhovsky's biomass is clearly commenting on Russian elites, how the beautiful exterior of the Kremlin lures ambitious youths in only to be absorbed into a cruel machine which has no regard for human life. Meanwhile, in the game, it's a bad boss fight without any context. More than anything else in the game, I find the biomass to be emblematic of how Metro 2033 fails as an adaptation, and I can't help but feel disappointed. Now that I've shared my views on Metro, let's see what other YouTubers have to say about it. To prepare for the YouTube discussion section of this video, I watched videos from Reykjavik, GmanLives, IGN, Nyxson, and Avalanche Reviews. Unsurprisingly, there are some common themes. Everyone praises the world of the game, the focus on immersion, and the atmosphere the game has. But another common theme is how janky the game can be. Reykjavik, for example, brings up how he got stuck in this hole you're supposed to go through in the library section, which I also got stuck on. GmanLives talks about how the stealth mechanics are really weird and janky sometimes, and how the game design is confused when it wants to be both tense with limited resources and at the same time forces you into lengthy gunfights. Ryan Clements from IGN brings up how bad the game is at explaining how some of the more unique weapons and systems like pressure-based weapon work. Nyxson talks about that the game is pretty short and makes the point that the voice actor is better in Russian, something I hadn't considered looking into before seeing that video. Interestingly, Avalanche Reviews makes the point that military-grade ammunition as currency is not just a fun gameplay system, but also could be seen as commentary on how violent the human societies in Metro can be. He also makes the really good point that the mutant encounters are a lot worse than the ones where you fight humans because of how bullet spongy the mutants tend to be. In essence then, the reviews I've seen of the game are slightly positive. Everyone agrees that this is a very interesting first game, and that the studio and the franchise has a lot of potential, even if it wasn't reached this time. Metro 2033 was fun to play when it was working as intended, even though it often wasn't. It has a lot of promising features, and I love its focus on immersion. I also just like and kinda miss games like it. It's rare to see a single-player first-person shooter nowadays, and it's a kind of game I really enjoy playing. But it's also a lousy and frankly dumbed-down adaptations of its source material. If you go into the game expecting to shoot some mutants and walk through some spooky tunnels, then you'll probably have a good time if you play on normal. But if you've read the book, you're in for quite the disappointment. Over the course of writing this review, I've kind of soured my opinion on the game, as engaging with it critically has reminded me of what was lost in Adaptation. It's not fair to say that Metro 2033 is a bad game, and it's most certainly not fair to harp on about how 4A's first game was a failure. At the same time, though, they didn't treat the novel fairly, and if they didn't understand what Glukowski was trying to communicate in his book, then I think they were the wrong people to adapt it. It's the video game equivalent of a Michael Bay remake of Apocalypse Now. Entertaining, good-looking for the time, and interesting in the way it completely misses the point of the original. Join me next time as we go to photography school on the west coast of the US. Also there's time travel.